Hey, what's going on? You're watching another episode in the long-running series where we basically take a camera anywhere we want to try and find secrets and discoveries in some of our favorite games. And before we begin today's episode, I want to give a massive thank you to Franz Bauma, who supplied the camera that I used for NieR Automata. And with that all said, I'm your co-host Snipey, and let's get right into the show. Okay, so if you've played NieR before, you know that the game is chock-load of symbolism. I'm not here to tell you about any of that, but what I can tell you is that behind the blindfolds on the main characters, who I can take the camera inside of, everybody else tends to disappear, we can see that the eyes are still there, sort of. If you look from the front, you're not going to really see anything other than your worst nightmare. And while those sockets may appear empty, don't be fooled quite yet, because going in through the back of the head lets us see the rendered eye. Now, this is a pretty classic case of the eye being mirrored on both sides, and I did my due diligence on this one, because at later points in the game, spoilers, the characters don't end up having the blindfolds on, and taking the camera into their brain, similar story. They've still got the backs of their eyes rendered. Okay, so unfortunately, there's not too many boss fights that I can look at from another angle, at least not any with this level of spectacality. Most of them happen in an arena of sorts, but these first couple cranes are quite special. The game eases you in with this very large crane with a saw, and interestingly enough, they went the full mile on this one. This crane is highly detailed from top to bottom, except that it's floating above and kind of gliding along the tracks. Also, during some of its attacks, the top part of the crane moves up and down slightly, kind of separating itself from the rest of the model. But that's pretty much it. For the most part, this is as crane as they come. And before you end up fighting Giant Mech Man, there's another fight with two cranes. Only this time the track situation gets a little bit worse because they're merged halfway through. When it comes to the fight with the big boy though, we've got quite a bit to look at. Number one, we can get a full view of what he looks like when you go into the water. And the one thing to note is that his moves are fully animated, even everything below the surface. The dude seems to be moving as accurately as possible given the circumstances, though he doesn't really seem to be submerged in the water all that much. And if you put the camera up right next to his face, all of the parts that you get to see when he opens up his face to shoot a laser at you are still completely visible, just being covered by that metal frame. And some of the fun things you can find when that frame is opened are an extra set of eyes on both sides of the head, a jaw that unhinges and reveals a laser, and a set of metal teeth. Here's another angle of what this guy looks like when he goes under the water, and he actually goes pretty deep, fully submerging himself under the surface, before doing this very simple animation that the player would never be able to see, damaging the bridge slightly with each hit until he does his big upswing and jumps back up to where he usually is, destroying a chunk of the bridge in the process. Mind you, this bridge does extend pretty far, at least before the fight begins, which you can see here. But later in the fight, even when the bridge isn't fully destroyed, something you may have noticed while you're flying around shooting at this guy, the bridge is completely unloaded from the scene, though it does pop back up later in the fight. And before we continue, if we take a look behind the video you're watching right now, you'll see today's sponsor, Bloodline, Heroes of Lithos. New legends will be born in this card-based strategy RPG, featuring a traditional Western fantasy theme and realistic 3D graphics. Bloodline Heroes of Lithos allows you to collect various champions, build kingdoms, and also create legendary heirs by combining the forces of various bloodlines. This all comes down to the game's unique heir system, which allows you to marry different bloodlines through companions, such as Fulgur, the demigod. This allows the passing down of traits to best suit your own gameplay, like this half-dragonborn, half-demigod heir you can obtain for free just by playing. You can level yourself up to unlock more companions for free and switch their genders freely, with your offspring becoming more powerful the higher your companion's intimacy is. You can create even stronger offspring by marrying champions, and by further developing the family tree, your champion will inherit the best traits from both parents. With a unique combination of powerful abilities, the possibilities are endless for you to choose your own path and raise heirs with true companions from a vast fantasy world. The game features a ton of characters with awesome designs, such as Karg, the Dragonborn, who you can unlock for free just by logging in, and Lycanis, the Werewolf, who is a must-try lineage. The game is free to play on Android and iOS devices, and you can click on the link in the description below or scan the QR code on screen right now to download and try out the game. Thanks again to Bloodline for sponsoring the video. And in case you're wondering where 9S goes when he flies off into the distance, he flies over to this pipe but then sort of merges in the top of it, and then is teleported somewhere that I could not for the life of me find. While we're at this factory, there's still a lot to see. Let's take a look at some of the low-poly objects that are off in the distance. A lot of the further objects just share the textures of the floor on this outside area, and these structures can give us a pretty good idea of how the game handles low-poly objects. There's almost never an object in the game that's half-modeled, with the main parts of the structures not really looking too bad. But when it comes to thin objects like railings and crossbars, they get pretty hard to see sometimes, almost to the point where you're kind of wondering why they're there to begin with. And for this particular tower, there's 3 different versions of it that you can find just in this opening area. The first one you'll end up seeing is in the opening flight section of the prologue. And for some reason, even though you're flying overhead and it kind of goes by really fast, this version of the tower is pretty high poly, especially compared to all the objects around it. But going back into the factory area, we have this high poly version of the tower with its own unique sort of rust texture. And then we have a low poly version of the tower with the same floor texture that I had mentioned earlier. And you may have noticed when you're walking inside and outside of this area in particular, that the environment looks like it's lighting up and dimming depending on the player position, even if the door is already closed. And I figured you guys would want to see that from another angle, so here's what it looks like from outside. You'll notice that it dims the area in 2 different sections. You have the outside lights that just sort of turn off, but there's still like a layer of smoke or cloudy stuff left behind that disappears later, depending on how far away you actually move. That includes the fire effect that's going on in the background over there. And then when you move out of the building a little further, then it lights up even more. And there are a couple more things to note before we leave this area. First off, the floor doesn't actually extend as far out from the player perspective as you would think. It actually doesn't go very far at all, and you can see the edge of the map with your own eyes. And this is pretty much the only time where this area of the map is loaded in. Inside the factory, though, we have a couple things that are pretty interesting. The game is pretty heavily focused on player perspective, often locking the camera in different views to give you a specific look to any particular area. There's this conveyor belt of crates that you've probably seen on your way through, and while on the inside, it looks perfectly functional. The crates rotate along and move along this conveyor belt. Sometimes they disappear and whatnot, but that's fine. But looking at it on the outside, there is no hole for the crates to leave. You never really see this, but it's funny that there is a level of disconnect between the 2 areas. Also, even this lava has more to it than it appears, because it's made up of 2 layers, one static layer at the bottom, and then a top animated layer, which is the one you actually see. And something we've seen before is that this is actually part of a larger texture that spans pretty much the entire room, with different sections cut off to represent different areas of lava. And we see a similar approach to layering in this opening section, because the water that's moving underneath the player is made up of 3 separate layers. You have a top water layer that seems to have 2 different animations playing on it at the same time. You have a bottom layer that is not moving at all. And you have a 3rd layer that seems to be attached to the camera position, and so when I move the camera up and down, it overlaps other objects in the scene. It's sort of a really interesting way to get this water done. And so I'm wondering really what they're doing with each individual layer. And by the way, before you fly over the water and you're flying over clouds, that's also a separate animated layer. And when you transition between the 2 areas, your ship just moves downwards. But that upper cloud layer, even though you never see it again, is still loaded into the scene. That laser that fires off screen, by the way, doesn't actually come from anything. But the funny thing is that it doesn't start too far away from where everybody is, but the endpoint for the laser is really far behind, like excessively far. And these purple orb projectiles that these enemies fire, their reflections seem to be in the middle of a field somewhere. And hey, those flight suits, there's always someone in them, even in the beginning of the game, when you can't see inside them, even for the other NPCs. And that transition when you go into that little factory tunnel, for the most part while you're flying along, the water is just sort of loading in front of you, and loading in front of you, loading in front of you. You start moving forward, and then eventually, it just plops in this large map section. Once you punch through that wall, it deloads the rest of the factory area pretty much immediately, and you're left with just the tunnel. And if we take a look on the side of the tunnel, you can see how far back it actually still renders, and something you'll see is that the lights in this tunnel aren't there until the player gets nearby. Interestingly enough though, even though you're in this tunnel, the water layers and cloud layer are still loaded into the scene, and are still following you as you move along this path. They don't deload at any point. Now, something that I didn't expect is right before you're about to fight the giant crane guy, off in the distance you can see part of the city ruins. But the thing about that is that there's a lot more of the map loaded than you would think. You have a ton of foliage, a lot of the buildings are still there, the save point is even loaded in, part of the desert area is even loaded in here, and way off into the distance, way further than you'd ever be able to see just on your own, there's the buildings that are in the water that are still loaded in over here. Now, I know the game is open world, but the interconnectivity of these maps and how much is loaded in at a single time is still surprising to see, and we'll come back to that later in the video with other areas. But before we do that, I wanted to take a look at one of the viewer requests that we had for this episode, which is to look at the bunker from an outside perspective. And while I know you guys kind of knew this, yes, the bunker is circular, but not all of it's loaded in at once. And when you run down the hallway, bits and pieces of the station are loaded in chunks. The way things load and unload isn't exactly uniform though. That giant screen in the briefing room sticks around the entire time. And that room itself stays loaded in for quite a while. And seemingly the only way to get it to despawn is to be basically on the entire other end of the station, at which point it just disappears. Oh yeah, and that earth that you can kind of glance at through the windows is actually a pretty big object. And if we go around it and look at it from the side, we can see that it's actually this really large convex shape, sort of to give the appearance of curvature, even though I'm not really sure if you can see that curvature all that well. And that ring around it that's giving it its glow is actually a separate object entirely. And you can see the space between the two if I look closely. The stars around in the sky sphere are very low res, but they get the job done pretty well. And because they surround you in a sphere, if I zoom the camera out, the portion of the map that contains the bunker and the stars just gets smaller and smaller, and pretty much just consumed by darkness, which I don't know, I guess is fun, maybe a little sad. And for those times when the camera shifts to 2D, most of the time you can see the full room's interior before you go inside of it. And so to pull off the trick of it missing a wall, when the camera moves outside to look inwards, whatever wall is there is culled out, and so nothing ends up getting rendered there, and so you have a full view into the room. And something I noticed while I was examining this hallway is that it's right on one of the triggers to load the next area of the bunker. And so looking towards this lack of a wall and running back and forth just pops that area of the bunker in and out of existence. And for those rooms that you can get a peek inside of, not a whole lot has changed about how they actually model the interiors. You know, they're still designed as normal rooms. But when it comes to those rooms that can only be seen from a fixed camera perspective, they don't even bother. The wall's just not even there. Take for example this castle area, which for the most part is only viewed from fixed camera perspectives, with each room kind of slotted together and dissected. And because the player can basically only see it from one way, anything that's off the beaten path in the other direction is just not there. And so they don't have the same obligation for interconnectivity. So some rooms will be floating, some areas just don't connect at all, and some areas of the map are kind of nonsensical. And in some cases when you turn around there won't be anything, and so you're basically just looking into the void. That kind of changes when they introduce windows, since they decided to have the windows be see-through. And so if you can see through the windows, there has to be something there. And so what they decided was large patches of grass with small little details across them, and these details extend far past the player's ability to actually see out these windows or explore in any capacity. And because the experience is so tailored when you go outside and just look around with the camera, there's so much hidden from the player in just this small little walkway of like 12 feet. I mean, look at this building, completely separate from its own self, with a tree halfway embedded inside it, and one of the roots is just completely disconnected. And this is actually a great time to talk about enemy spawns, because later on in the area, there's these two sets of stairs that go down probably about 30 steps each into nothingness, and some enemies spawn out of them, and what happens is they just sort of boop into existence and then just sort of run up the stairs and attack you. And honestly, I was sort of expecting them to spawn in a little room or something, but no, it's just stairs. Good for them, I guess. That's some cardio. And while we're at the castle, I might as well answer a burning question you might have. Is the baby always there? The answer is no. But also, neither is the crib. When you first go into the area and you're kind of moving through, the crib is there. When you get closer to the room, the crib unloads at some point, but then when you're right about to enter, the crib loads back into the scene with the baby inside it. And I know I said we're done in the factory, but real quick, I just want to go back in here and point out that for whatever reason, at some point during the game, this building is loaded in twice, and I don't know why. And it just looks really, really dumb. So, have a gander, enjoy this one. I really needed to show someone else. Most of the things that are rendered in high detail in NieR are super close by to the player, and so when you move the camera even kind of a medium distance away, objects start to get really low poly. And so I figured I'd show you a couple of the areas that I looked through. So for the city, there's not a whole lot going on. You have low poly buildings, some trees. This hole in the wall can be represented by just a picture of gray. And for some reason, on this side of the map, there's a low poly floor that expands over this ravine area, but it's very crudely done. Fun little fact, by the way, the city has two skyboxes. Both of them are the same image, but one of them is wrapped around in a sphere, and then the other one is a static skybox. And here's a look at the amusement park. For this main hub area, a lot of the buildings are very, very, very low poly. And so there's a lot of spaces between the seams of the building. The lights are little triangle things. The fence is now made up of sort of abstract shapes. This large building with a heart on it's basically only rendered from the front. All of the glowing windows are floating off of the wall. The Ferris wheel is in pretty rough shape, but overall not doing too bad. And the track that the coaster would go around is not fully complete. Over in the desert, we've got a whole bunch of rocks with tons of stretching going on over them. Some of them have these wacky white objects that are only visible from way up above, which the player would never be able to see. Some of them aren't even covering anything. They're just way out into the distance. I'm not really sure what this is here for. And while we're on the topic of low poly, I have a really cool low poly bird to show you. Yes, it's that part of the episode. And what's interesting about this bird is that on the surface, it looks like a 3D model, but it's actually a really cool trick of two perpendicular textures, one placed vertically and one placed horizontally, that when put together and made completely pitch black, from any viewing angle that's not the direct front or direct behind, it has a pretty convincing 3D effect. One of the most asked viewer requests, by the way, was to see where these hacking minigames take place in the game world. People assume that because they load so fast, they have to be in the map somewhere, and those people are correct. I have a couple of examples in this. One is in the city, which is located over here underneath the floor somewhere, and I actually paused the game in the middle of it loading back in the scene, so we can see both it and the map loaded in at once. And the other is when you're going to the base of the tower, but it's way off in the distance, not exactly close by. And this minigame map in particular that gets spawned in seems to go for quite a bit, and by quite a bit, I mean very, 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 very far. There is a bottom. I found the bottom. You had to go really fast to find it, but you can't really see the progress on it since it's just a solid object, and there's not really any visual indicators of speed. But trust me when I say, it took forever to find the bottom of this thing. It goes on for quite a bit, unnecessarily so, considering that you only see it from the top, but maybe that's the point. And hey, on the topic of the tower, we have yet another viewer request, which is, how big is this damn thing? And, it's big. Very, very big, actually. I could barely get the entire thing in a single shot before it actually started unrendering stuff because it was too far outside of the camera's view. But think of it this way, it is gigantic and makes the rest of the map that's loaded in around it seem small in comparison. And I know earlier in the video, I mentioned that the areas have a ton loaded in at any given point. And so real quick, I just wanted to do a few zoom outs of a couple of the areas in the game to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. Something you probably would have expected from the game that's not actually done here is that in the city area, when a giant crater opens up in it, it's not actually rendered below the main area the entire time. This is actually a separate piece of the map that gets loaded in instead. So yeah, that alien ship that you can visit is not loaded in at all times, but this is what that area looks like when it is loaded in. And you can see that the room that it's held inside is just a big old cylinder, and the area that you get to go into and fight inside of is actually just a tiny fraction of that. By the way, these objects past the window are fully modeled, and not just part of the floor or anything. And I know what you came here looking for, and I know you're gonna be disappointed, and maybe you already knew, but there's nothing inside this church. There's no mystery door that leads anywhere. There's nothing on the other side here. Sorry. But something interesting that I did find is actually near the end of the game, when you enter the tower, taking the camera outside and backwards a little bit, there's a building that appears to be the same one in the amusement park, which I'll show you right now, except it's all dilapidated and destroyed, with what seems to be engine parts scattered all over the front of it, and most of it missing a whole bunch of geometry. From what I know, you don't visit this place in the tower, and the version of the building that you end up going to is over in the amusement park. So why this is here, I'm not really sure, but maybe it's just a leftover element. And I'm gonna try to show this to you with the best of my ability, but elevators in this game are really weird. So they use a combination of tactics to make the elevators look like they're moving. And for the most part, they actually are. But for this elevator specifically, at some point it just stops, and the wall on the side is a very large texture that just continues to move, and then warps back into place to give you the illusion of movement while this cave area loads in. And looking at it all together, it looks really strange to see it kind of stop and have everything load in, while stuff is still moving all around it. There's actually a lot of objects loaded into the map pretty much at all times, even if the area of the map isn't. And so a couple examples of that are usually boxes. These boxes, for example, are way out in the middle of nowhere. And over in the desert, we have this cascade of corpses that just sits there forever. And then back at the castle, we just have some sets of knight armor just hanging out. And across the game, oftentimes you'll see off in the distance or kind of close by some low-poly robots, and I want to take a moment to look at them. These ones are in a crate, not up to a whole lot, and these ones are probably the most common one that you'll come across, either strewn about in the background or across the map in various sections, where the bodies of these robots are just sort of strewn about everywhere. This video is a bit of a long one, and so unfortunately, it does have to come to a close. And so to end this video off, I just wanted to take a look at some of the idle animations that these robots have in the castle section, with their leader giving what seems to be a quite inspiring speech. And so that about wraps it up. As always, if you have any feedback for me, please let me know down in the comments below. I'm super thankful to SheSays, as always, for this opportunity. Whatever day you're watching this, I hope you have a great one, and I will see you guys in the next video. See ya.